Hello, everybody. It's Dr. Nicole here, coming to you to talk about something so vital. We're going to talk all about intimacy. I know you hear the word a lot, but we're going to dig into the different types of intimacy, and especially for women, what you need to do to cultivate or develop healthy intimacy in your relationships. All right, so you ready to dig in? All right. So a lot of you all probably hear the word intimacy thrown around a lot because it's something important to relationships, right? We hear people talk about intimacy, and usually what comes to mind is what, right? Tell me what usually comes to mind with that. We usually think about sexual intimacy, right? That's the key thing, that when we hear intimacy, right? Am I right? We usually think about sex and sexual intimacy. But there are so many other types or subtypes of intimacy that are just as important and that also play a big part in sexual and physical intimacy. So I want to dig into them. So first of all, what is intimacy, right? It's one of those words that we tend to throw around a lot. Like you just hear, you need to be intimate, or I want to develop intimacy, or intimacy is important for a relationship. But what exactly is intimacy, right? Well, the word has its root and core meaning that is related to closeness. Right? Anything where we're getting close, we're connected to somebody else. That's when we're talking about intimacy. It's also associated with familiarity. So there's a certain comfort, familiarity, closeness that develops between people. Right? And one of the things I also want to talk about is how important it is first to develop intimacy with yourself. But I'm going to get into that. So we're really talking about closeness, about comfort, about connection and familiarity, right? Those are some of the key words. And think about it, right? When you talk about being intimate with somebody, usually in a relationship, what are some of the things that you think about that go along with being intimate, right? One of them is probably the importance of feeling safe. We don't usually associate being intimate or intimacy with in a situation or with a person where you don't feel safe or you don't have some kind of connection or a sense of trust, right? That you could trust, feel safe, and connect with this person. So all of those are key parts, key ingredients to this idea of how you connect with another person. But I want to talk about 7 core types of intimacy. One is the one that we all hear about that I mentioned earlier, and that is sexual intimacy. There's also physical intimacy, which is a little bit different, and I'll tell you how. There is mental or intellectual intimacy. There's emotional intimacy. There is spiritual intimacy. There is experiential, right? So I said spiritual and then experiential, like what you experience together, intimacy. And here's one that might seem like a contradiction to you. There is conflict intimacy. So let's dig deep into them, right? Those 7 types. So first I mentioned sexual intimacy. I think that's what we're most familiar with, right? If you ask somebody, oh, have you been intimate with that person? Usually what comes to mind is, have you had some sort of sexual interaction with that person? So we are familiar with that aspect of having sex or being sharing some sort of sexual experience with a person, and that is an important part of intimacy, especially in romantic relationships, in marriage, long-term committed relationships, or just hookups that a lot of people tend to have, to be honest with you. But related to that is physical intimacy. So you can be physical, meaning that there's touch, that there's hugging, that there's even like eye contact and connection with somebody that constitutes or makes up physical intimacy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's sexual intimacy. And one of the things that we know for sure is that Physical intimacy, especially with, with couples, is an important part of helping both of the people feel safe enough or feel comfortable with sexual intimacy. So they go hand in hand, but they are slightly different. So we have physical touch, hugging, cuddling, eye contact. And then we have sexual interaction, sexual intercourse, related sexual acts, right? That's physical and sexual intimacy. The other one that is really important too is emotional intimacy. That's the third one, right? Emotional intimacy. What do you think that is? Right? Emotional intimacy is where you share a sense of being able to share your feelings, what you're going through, how you're feeling, what emotions you're experiencing with another person, right? Remember, we said intimacy is like closeness, connection, right? So you get close to somebody or you share, you have a connection with them based on being able to share your emotions, or you all sharing similar feelings or emotions. This is a key part of, you hear a lot of people talking about trauma bonds. A lot of times trauma bonds are formed through emotional intimacy. It's not the sex, it's not the physical stuff. It's that sense of like, oh, this person really gets me. If you refer back to the other video that I did about the 4 types of men that you want to avoid, one of those was, which one was one of them? The wounded warrior. That's because they can be so good at making an emotional connection with you, where you feel so seen and so heard and so understood. It feels like emotional intimacy on overdrive, right? So, and I talked about some of the potential downsides of that. But a lot of times the trauma bonds they come about through this emotional intimacy, right? Where you just feel like you remember I said one of the building blocks of intimacy and closeness is what? Feeling safe, trusting. So when you're able to share your feelings or emotions with somebody, that heightens your sense of like, oh my gosh, this is really a safe place. I feel so seen. I feel so heard, right? So that's emotional intimacy. And think about that. Trauma bonds really are cemented through emotional intimacy. Sometimes an emotional connection with someone can be so much more powerful than any other kind of connection, because our emotions are like the core of makeup of who we are and that make up our identity. So if we feel like we can be close with someone emotionally and share how we feel, or we feel like they can understand us, that really like creates a bond. Now, in a healthy relationship, hey, bingo, good thing, right? But in some of those unhealthy ones, like I talked about with the wounded warrior, where you're developing these trauma bonds, that is something you want to look out for, okay? The 4th type that I listed is the mental or intellectual intimacy. This is where you really vibe with someone on an intellectual level, where you feel like you can share you can kind of have those deep philosophical discussions. You can share your opinions and your viewpoints and feel really stimulated. Like you feel like that person is on your level, and you really connect to them around like shared intellect, or just shared intellect and intelligence. Have you ever heard the term sapiosexual? Yes, you're right. Mental stimulation is so important. And you brought up a good point, because each of these aspects of intimacy is really important, right? You don't want to have a relationship, at least like a healthy relationship, that is too unbalanced, where you only have one type, where you only have those deep emotional sort of trauma bonds, but you don't have healthy spiritual intimacy or physical intimacy or some conflict intimacy that I'm going to talk about, right? So you want to make sure that they're in balance. I was saying, have you heard the term sapiosexual? That's this idea that you get really stimulated by someone else's mind. Okay. Now, this is where a lot of women Sometimes because a lot of women are getting more education, highly educated and skilled, relationships are shifting. The culture is shifting. So women can sometimes feel like they don't really connect with men on that level if they feel like they have reached a certain intellectual stage and they're looking for that stimulation. Yeah, what you said, that's you, where you need mental stimulation. Yes. So that's where okay, you said this is good stuff. Please post. Yes, I will post this live. I will make sure I keep it up. And I also made an actual post that goes with this so you can read about it. But that's where the culture is shifting, right? Because a lot of men, and traditionally male gender roles were like men were the providers, women were the caretakers and nurturers. Men had more status and education and financial security. A lot of that is shifting, and a lot of women now have become over decades more educated, more stable and established. So what they're looking for in relationships may not be the same thing as before. And what people are looking at, what men are looking for might be more of a traditional role, or not to be they're not used to necessarily that mental stimulation is as important to women as other aspects like security and intimacy and so forth, and even emotional stimulation. Because a lot of times men will feel like, yes, I know that that's important to women, but they may not understand just how much intellectual or mental stimulation is important as well. So you said, what happens if a relationship lacks mental stimulation? Okay, that is key. I'm going to get to the last few types of intimacy, and then I will answer that. So we did physical, sexual, emotional, mental, intellectual, and then we have spiritual intimacy, right? Spiritual is not the same as religious. You can share a religious background with someone, but that doesn't mean you're going to have spiritual intimacy. Spiritual intimacy is when you have a shared sense of like a higher purpose and how that higher purpose is important to you and connecting to that. So whether it's through religion or some other form of like feeling like that there's more to life than just you, your material needs, and what you're trying to do. It's like the big picture. And a lot of couples will share spiritual intimacy as far as their service work, the way that they want to like do charity, the way they want to be involved in their religious institutions and so forth. But it really varies. It's really like connecting around a shared sense of purpose, higher purpose and meaning in life. So that is really important, right? Think about all of these things that I'm listing, and think about how in a long-term committed relationship, in a marriage, it cannot be sustained only with physical or sexual intimacy, although those things are very important, right? So think about these other types of intimacy and where they fit in. The sixth one is experiential intimacy. And that's where like when partners have something in common, they do things together. There's a sense of experiencing new and novel, situations, traveling, volunteering, doing hobbies together, being active in the community together. So that's experiential intimacy. That's kind of like being out in the world together, right? And that can be very important. And then the final one that I want to talk about is one that might surprise people, because remember I said intimacy is about closeness and connection, and you need trust and safety. Well, the seventh one is called conflict intimacy. Have you heard that before? Right? Conflict intimacy. So in order to actually have a healthy relationship where both people can get their needs met, where there are healthy boundaries, where you can communicate, you have to be able to have healthy conflict. And that's usually the one area that people don't talk about a lot, or we don't learn about a lot, right? So we learn about, yes, how to be, attractive to your man and all this stuff, but we don't learn necessarily either by modeling that we see around us or just being taught directly how important conflict management is, and conflict resolution, healthy communication skills, learning how to listen and hear what your partner says, learning how to express what you feel, learning how to agree to disagree, or learning how disagreement and conflict is not the end of the world, right? And for a lot of people, when they grew up in unhealthy households where they didn't see healthy models of conflict, they might have seen a lot of arguing and fighting, or a stuffing, where maybe, especially this happens a lot with the female partner, where they tend to stuff and not say what they feel and tend to be more passive aggressive because of like power differences in the relationship. A lot of times people will feel like they don't want anything to do with conflict because either conflict was explosive or it was where you couldn't express yourself. So they don't think of conflict as, and being able to do conflict in a healthy way. You said I always speak my mind. They don't think of doing conflict in a healthy way as part of cultivating and creating intimacy that will actually sustain their long-term relationship. Right? So I'm going to answer the question I had before and also your comment. But I just wanted to recap on the 7 types of intimacy. So there was physical intimacy, sexual intimacy, emotional intimacy, mental or intellectual intimacy, spiritual intimacy, experiential, like where you're experiencing things with your partner, intimacy, and finally, conflict intimacy. So mental health over stigma, you said, I always speak my mind. Yes, and that seems to be your personality. I think you always have to temper like what your personality is with compromise in a relationship, right? Because there are some people who don't speak their mind, and that is really unhealthy in a relationship. Because usually what that tends to lead to is passive aggressive behavior. Like you're stuffing things, you're becoming resentful, and you're not speaking your mind. And you're like kind of just slowly stewing until you might explode. On the other hand, you do have people that have no problem whatsoever expressing and speaking their mind, but you have to know how, when, and where to do that, right? Because speaking your mind could be getting your needs met, but you have to look at if that is stifling your partner's needs, right? You can speak your mind as long as you listen to what your partner is saying and consider it and see how it fits in, like if you all need to compromise more or negotiate. I wrote this article about like the different types of conflict resolution, and the highest form is when you can negotiate and compromise. So it can feel like a win-win to both partner versus like, oh God, I'm just doing this because he wants me to, right? But doing that takes high level communication skills where you're actively listening, where you're using I statements, not like, I'm just going to tell you off, but like where you're using I statements, and where you are, where you're willing to shift a little bit and move positions a little bit, right? Because you recognize that what's good for your partner can also be what's good for you, right? So that's like a higher level. You said, where can we find the article? I will, it's on my website, but I'll post a link to it in my bio. And I also break it down in my book, The Boundaries to Bliss Blueprint. I kind of make it more, accessible. I break it down in a way where you can apply it to your life. So you also were saying, you were asking me, mental health over stigma, what happens if there is no if a relationship lacks mental stimulation? Yes, that is a great point. So basically, a healthy relationship will where both partners. What is a healthy relationship? First of all, a healthy relationship is the opposite of a toxic relationship. It's a relationship where both partners feel like they can get their needs met, different needs, their emotional needs, their physical needs, their spiritual needs, their social needs, right? It's a relationship where they can communicate and where they can have healthy conflict. Now, one of the things that is sort of like hard about relationships, the modern relationships, so to speak, is we put so much into our partner, especially once we get married. We feel like that one person is supposed to be the end all and be all of everything. So they're supposed to meet every single need. They're our best friend. They're our, spiritual advisor. They're the ones that we're sexual with. They're the ones that, we share our financial lives with. Like, it's so much pressure. And usually, like in older times, it was more spread out, where people had more community. So you would like rely on your village more, your extended family, your friends network. So your one partner isn't like bogged down with meeting every single need of yours. Okay. So that's something to think about. Like, how can you spread out getting your needs met in different ways, so you're not trying to rely on one person, because that is so much pressure on one person, right? So, but even with that, even with like spreading out your needs, you still want to look at the types of intimacy needs you have with your partner. And so if there is no mental stimulation, you can do a few things. You can talk to your partner about it and let him know that this is important to you, right? You can look for other ways to get that stimulation through like reading groups or whatever other communities where you feel like you get stimulated. You can try to up stimulation in other areas with your partner. So I have found like a lot of women, for example, they might feel like their husband likes to go out and do activities, and that's how they connect. So they can get a sense of mental stimulation or intellectual stimulation by going out and getting that experiential intimacy. Like, they go and do things together. I know that like a lot of times, if you try to figure out what it is that your partner likes and kind of learn more about that, as opposed to expecting them to always come and be interested in what you're interested in, that could develop that mental stimulation. The other thing is when you, all right, we skipped over the first one we talked about, and we haven't gone into that much, was physical and sexual intimacy. We know that sex is a core part of relationships, right? It's a core part of marriage and, long-term relationships. And it depends, on your background, what you value or whatever, like the conditions under which you would be sexually intimate with someone. But it's something that a lot of times what people I work with tend to believe that it's just going to happen. Like, because sex is instinctual, they feel like it's going to be natural and easy to get in sync with each other. So they miss out on all of the stuff about how you need to communicate what you want, what you need, what you enjoy, how you have to learn about yourself, and you have to help your partner learn about you, right? So what is the key word to all of this? Communication. There's a lot of talk about how there are a lot of sexless marriages, a lot of marriages where people are unsatisfied, they're out of sync. And a lot of that is because people, quite frankly, never sat down to talk to each other and communicate. Even if it's not, they haven't communicated in any kind of way or even communicated with themselves to really tap in and know what they enjoy, what they need, and what they want to learn more about. That will take me into a whole other direction, because one of the things I found is so many people, especially the women I work with, have a history of sexual abuse. And if they haven't fully dealt with it, processed it, healed from it, then it can come out in different ways in their relationship. It might come out where they're overly promiscuous and out, like they just are out there, doing whole phase all over the place. Or it could come out where they don't feel safe in like a close committed relationship. They don't feel safe having emotional intimacy and sexual intimacy together. So they split it up. Like the person that they're emotionally connected to, they don't feel comfortable expressing or talking about their sexual needs. So they kind of go and do casual random sex, right? And again, these are all things that like you have to go so deeply into to really understand for yourself how this applies to you. But what I will say is if you know that you have a history of any kind of sexual abuse or sexual being violated or exploited, you have to get help. You have to directly heal from that. It's going to come out in one way or another within your relationships, right? It's either going to make you overly sensitive or make you cut off from your feelings where you can't really connect to yourself and what you're feeling, let alone connect to another person. So it's so important to really like address that issue from the beginning. The last thing I will say is that I was talking earlier about physical intimacy and sexual intimacy are two different things. And a lot of times what women need to feel really sexually connected in a relationship are a few things. And I'm saying in a relationship, right? They need to have more frequent physical touch. So that's not just, that's like throughout the day, hugging, holding hands, things like that, especially, and that's for both partners, especially if the love language is physical touch, right? But a lot of times women need a sense of emotional safety and mental and intellectual, like, stimulation, which goes back to the question you asked earlier. So when you feel like they say that the most, for women, the biggest sexual organ is the mind, right? Like make me feel safe mentally, make me feel heard and seen, make me feel safe emotionally. And then, the rest falls into your lap. So that's why I said you have to be careful also when you have a deep level of emotional intimacy with someone where there's like a trauma bond, that wounded warrior that you hear me talk about, that man who's the wounded warrior. You got to be careful with those deep emotional bonds because that will make you a lot of times as the woman just fall into like a connection with someone that can be hard to break. So for women, the sexual connection encompasses so much, oftentimes. And what I find is it's so important to express what you want, what you need. And at the end of the day, all of these types of intimacy start where? Where do you think they start? They start with you, right? I will leave you with, oh, this was really good. Thank you. I'm so glad you liked it. I'm going to leave you with something my mom taught me from the time I was in middle school. She said, always learn. She didn't say just love yourself. She said, always like yourself. So yes, we always hear about self-love and we know that's important. But she told me, always like yourself. Never be afraid to spend time alone where you could go to a bookstore or go for a walk or do anything by yourself. Always enjoy your own company. And I take that to mean like always learn to be comfortable with intimacy with yourself. Because if you're not able to be with yourself, you can't really expect somebody else to do that either, right? So it's so important to start with intimacy with yourself. And then you can learn about all of these other types. I would say the unspoken type of intimacy was the last one I mentioned, which was conflict intimacy. And if you notice in a relationship, after you have healthy conflict, what happens? You usually feel closer to that person. the time you say something that maybe you were scared to say, or mental health over stigma, you said you speak your mind anytime. But there always, for anybody, is something that like a no-go zone that they feel like, I don't know if I want to talk about that. Once you cross that line and you find a way to communicate about that one thing, you will find that your relationship becomes stronger and you get closer. You feel closer, more intimate in other ways with your partner. Okay, so I didn't want to make this too long. The other thing that I would say is that never underestimate the power of physical and sexual intimacy also to help you reconnect with your partner so that you can be more prepared to kind of have those talks or go through conflict or whatever, right? Sometimes we do need to connect on a physical level to feel like we can kind of, feel safe to have those hard conversations, as we say. So the last thing you say, can you do a live on healing the inner child? Yes, I will. That is at the root of so much of this, right? Like when people have difficulty with trust, with communication, with sexual intimacy, or any other types of especially emotional intimacy, where they don't have enough boundaries, it's usually because of an inner child wound that needs to be healed. So I will do that. All right, you got me. All right, I'm going to do that one tomorrow. I'll do that tomorrow. We'll do healing the inner child, and so that you can be healthier in your relationships. Okay, so thank you all for joining. Don't forget to go to the link in my bio. My ebook is on pre-order, The Boundaries to Bliss Blueprint for women who are finally able to win at, or who are finally ready to win at love. I break down everything you need for self-love, healthy boundaries, and thriving, fulfilling relationships. Okay. What time I will probably do, I'm going to post it in my stories. I just need to check something. I'll do a post and I'll put it in my stories so you know what time to tune in tomorrow. Okay. Thank you so much for the questions, and I'll see you tomorrow. Healing the inner child. Okay. Take care.